Hey boys and girls, it's Nightstalker here. Welcome along to the Longsword and Shield guide for Season 7 and Runes. Check it out. Today we're going to talk about things like hearing chatter about how Longsword's no good because it doesn't do enough damage, which is completely untrue because it's all about battle control and support. We're going to talk about your builds that you can make with your Longsword, and that's going to include gear, the runes and stats that you can use to build. We're going to talk about all its abilities, like its block and overhand strike at the same time, and all of its skills, like the Paladin, or the best ult in the game, Clash of Shields. We're also going to talk about some complementary units, and some units that are less complementary to use with the Longsword. And you can make some decisions then about what sort of units you want to work towards in the tech tree and seasonal units. And the last thing, I'm going to show you a little bit about dueling, really. Longsword's not made for dueling, but often you will find yourselves in a deathmatch, which everybody's going to have to play if you want to work your way through the challenges. And also, something that's really important is point holding. You know, the Longsword might find themselves alone against 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 heroes at a time when they're holding points. And so your dueling skills are actually quite important, and we're going to talk about those. Without any further ado, let's take the King of Weapons and move along to our first segment. Alrighty, in our first segment, we're going to talk a little bit about all of the engine room stuff, the stats, the gear, and the runes. The first thing I want to talk a lot about is actually the gear, because gear is as important, if not a little bit more important, than your stats are. So let's have a look at that first. When you get a weapon for a longsword, the main thing I think that you would probably want to go for is armor penetration. So whether that be any of the three, piercing, slashing, or blunt. And that can be quite handy because you do reasonably low levels of damage as a longsword. You are certainly not about doing damage. If you're looking for a damage dealing class with heavy armor, you're certainly better at looking at maybe glaive, definitely more. But the longsword isn't about dealing a whole bunch of damage. So the things you want to look for really are those 3 piercing penetrations. And that will help you do a lot more damage to the more heavily armored stuff, particularly heroes, where you're going to have to fight them, and in later levels, the very heavily armored infantry. But the truth is, with a longsword, any of these stats are fine, because its abilities use all 3. Your overhand stab while you're protecting yourself with your shield, for example, uses piercing. So do some of your skills. Your slashing armor penetration is certainly your main one because the majority of your damage will be coming from that with Valor skill that we'll talk about later. And using your ult, your Clash of Shields ult, will definitely use your blunt armor penetration, as will things like your shield bash skill, and part of the with Valor skill is actually a blunt attack as well, the third of the 4 chaining ones. But overall, if you're a well-rounded and flexible longsword, any of these stats at all are perfectly fine. So what I tend to do is I look for the highest numbers. It's as simple as that, because I use all of the damage types. With armor, health is always going to be a good bonus to have on your gear. With your Mercy of Heaven and how your healing scales, the health is a really useful thing to have. Critical defense, not so much. You're a big meat tank anyway. Taking a little bit of extra damage from criticals is not the end of the world. But of course, your defenses are important too. But the stat on armor that I think is most important for a longsword is the leadership down the bottom there after critical defense, because you'll get to use more units. Longswords are very much battle control and unit support type heroes. And the more units you can take, the more you can do your job, really. You'll see that my leadership stats here, they add up to a total of plus 70. And that means I get to take an extra 70 leadership worth of troops, or 10% more than everyone else, onto the battlefield. And that is, of course, a really strong advantage. You may not wish to do that, particularly if you're one of the builds where you are damage dealing longsword, but overall I find it's the best one to have, pretty much for any class, but especially for a longsword. So take that into consideration when you're looking for gear. The ones that I look for, me personally, are health and leadership, especially if I can get them combined together like these ones. Now, in stats and stat builds, there are, in the new meta, I don't know, I hate the term meta, there are really 3 major kinds, I think, of longsword build. But let me tell you before I get started on these, that the best longsword build in the entire game is the one that you enjoy, very much seriously. What I'm about to tell you is certainly based on how to optimize and maximize your time as a longsword. But if you like a skill, if you like building in a certain way, and you like playing in a certain way, well, that is the best way to play longsword. This is a game, and we play for fun, and I can't stress it enough. If you like it, do it. If you like it and it's not meta, do it anyway. Really, really, really important to enjoy your time here in the game, or you'll just get sick of it and leave. So, the three main types of longsword build is, the first is my personal favourite, the armor meatball hybrid, which builds like this. First of all, I dump all of my armor, all of my stat points into armor. I didn't used to do this if you've seen any of my previous guides, and there's a reason for that. Armor has always been beneficial to a longsword, but you've always been limited by how many you can stack in here. But now with the new rune system, you'll see that I can use runes to increase my health. Right? You'll see that I have a lot of health runes. The other ones I like taking at the moment are anything which reduces damage upon you. When you're watching this video, it may not be Season 7 anymore, and you want to think, what runes should I take? Well, in this case, I've taken reduced damage by 5%. The other stuff is pretty nice as well, nearby allies, blah, 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 but you have to die for that to happen. So the damage reduction is important. And this one here I quite liked a little bit better because it's better than 250 health, right? It's increased your damage by 5%. Again, really nice. And the only other one that I take that is not health bonus is this one here. And the reason I take this one is because Clash of Shields can already knock cavalry out of charges, and it can take out units of things like pikes. But now you'll be able to do things like charge hussars, which are the strongest charge unit in the game, the cavalry unit, tier 5 gold unit. You can charge straight into the front of them with this skill and not die, and just knock them all out of the charge and leave your units to take care of them. The other thing is, of course, if you want to charge now, you can do it into the front of a braced Fortebraccio pike block, or any pikes, using this ability, because you take 40% less damage. It's also exceptionally good when you're using it to get away. Like you're locked in a combat with a couple of people that you can't beat, you do your Clash of Shields, knock them both over and get out of there, and you've got a damage reduction at the same time. This is, if you've experienced in the game, you know about short swords and their iron sides. This is better than iron sides because it's a much greater increase in your your armor and survivability, but also there's no downside of having the debuff at the end of it like you do with the short swords, iron sides. So I strongly recommend this one. The other one that goes into this season anyway, into the longsword, is this one. Recover 1% of health while 25% or effect lasts until you exceed 50%. The thing about longsword is that you have a giant deep health pool, so this would help. Certainly it would scale well, but the reality is that you hit the key that allows you to use your Mercy of Heaven skill. In my case, it's R. Hit the R key, and you immediately get 30% of your health points back. Well, over the next 10 seconds, you'll get all of that back. So I find that given how often you can heal yourself anyway, I find that this really isn't all that useful. Certainly not for the top tier gold rune, which would reduce your other runes that you can take. So for this season, this one here is my choice, and I would recommend that you carry that through into new seasons when new runes become available that are not these exact ones. Damage reduction, really, really important for a longsword, and health. In this build, health. So the next what would you call it, build style of longsword is the full meatball, which basically is very similar to the hybrid, where you use the armor, but instead you dump all of your stats into health, into toughness, as well as all of your runes, and you get over 40,000 odd hit points doing this when you combine it with things like your guardsman set bonus, which is this gear here, right? Get another 5% health. All your gear, you get maybe another 500 per gear item. You just become this just absolute giant meatball. And it scales really well with your Mercy of Heaven skill, because you get 30% of that back every 20 seconds, right? So you're coming back with 13 or 14,000 hit points every time you use your Mercy of Heaven skill, and you become very, very hard to kill. One of the things that this is especially good in is bleeds. When you fall off, buildings and walls, you will take just the same amount of damage, but it's a much smaller percentage of your health pool, and you can survive this much more often, especially when you get thrown over by mauls and all that sort of really awful stuff. The other things are like dual blades. Dual blades will ignore your armor for the most part if they're doing it right. And of course, if you're relying on your armor, you'll very quickly get whittled down. It is hard for a dual blade to kill a heavy armor user anyway, but if you get caught on low health, then the deeper health pool is certainly going to be more useful in that situation, as it is with artillery. So ballistas, trebuchets, grape shot cannons, all of that ignores your armor. So if you have nothing but a massively deep hit point pool, well then you're going to really survive those things a lot more often. And it becomes very, very hard to kill you when you're getting targeted by high penetration attacks, like say a longbow sniping you in the head consistently. And in these situations, it's much better than using the armor. And this is also a very good build. One of the things that has now come into the game is, you wouldn't have heard me saying this 3 or 4 months ago, is that you can make a attack or a damage longsword. Is it as effective as a sustain and rock type, hit me, come at me bro type longsword? The answer is definitely not. It is not an optimal build. But what you would want to do is you would want to put all of your points into strength and agility to get more slashing and piercing damage, more slashing and piercing armor penetration, and of course a little bit more blunt as well, because that scales quite well with some of your skills. It's not optimal because it's not playing to the strength of the longsword, but it is certainly a very interesting and often quite fun way to play the longsword. There are lots of people now doing this because it's become more viable this season than it's ever been. In previous seasons, you just couldn't really be an attack longsword. But now you've got the ability where people think, it's a longsword, I'm going to try and bounce them off. And then you whip out some giant combos that do a few thousand damage to them, and they're just reeling because they're not expecting a longsword to be spec'd for damage. The type of runes that you would want to take for attacking would be, let's have a look here. So Shield Bash, very nice. We'll talk about the skills later, but also any of these extra armor penetration and extra damage. So really, I would recommend taking the slashing, because the majority of your raw damage is going to come from your slashing abilities, like with Valor and Paladin particularly, which we'll talk about again a little bit later. And that same theory would roll over to the other parts of the armor, although you have got some interesting things here that you can add. Every 10 unit kills, for example, would increase your damage dealt by 10% for 10 seconds. Now, if you're not spec'd with strength and agility, you've got really not a lot of hope of killing 10 units in 10 seconds. Well, it's not 10 seconds to kill them, but you're not going to be killing nearly as many units if you're the sustain, the tank, or the meatball type longsword. And even if you're an attack longsword, this one is never going to work for you as well as it is for like a dual blades or a glaive or anything like that. And you would really want to avoid these bandage skills because they take up slots, right? And you're always constantly healing yourself anyway. You would probably still want to take these two skills here, actually, as a longsword. I'm really serious, because they will still give you a lot of tankiness, and it still increases your damage output, really. All of these ones here that sit you below 30% health are a bad choice for longsword, because as soon as you hit your Mercy of Heaven, which you're going to be doing every 20 seconds, you're going to get 30% of your health points back anyway. So avoid anything that will give you bonuses on low health, because it's just not useful to a longsword. And again, you would want to work with your slashing, armor penetration, and slashing damage from these selections here. I wouldn't worry about these situational ones. Really 10% of your slashing damage is something like 100, right? And you might as well get half of that all the time rather than 10% of it only in specialized situations. So I'd recommend, given your low damage scaling, your low damage overall as a longsword, certainly the flat increase all the time would be better for you if you're going to take the spank tank or assault knight type you know, build. All right. From there, I think I've just done about lots of talking, so let's move along to our next segment. Here is the basic attack of the longsword. You'll notice that it does 4 quick strikes and then has a pause. If you want to get more damage out of your auto attacks, for want of a better term, only do the first 3. Don't trigger the 4th one. That way you'll get to do more attacks much more quickly. One of the most amazing abilities that the longsword has is this giant shield. They're the best unit in the game at blocking. We're the best hero in the game at blocking. Keep that shield up. You have a very deep block pool. You can take crossbow bolts, musket shots all day. The only things that will really start to knock it down quickly are high impact attacks like heroes and cavalry and things like that, or of course if you're becoming overwhelmed by many units. The other thing you can do here, when you've got your block up, you can attack while you're blocking. See here? Hold your block and start clicking with your left click, and this will do a repeated overhand stab, in which case you cannot be injured. Well, you can be injured. Here's the thing about a block. If someone is shooting at you or striking at you, they can hit the tippy top of your head and they can hit your legs. If you're not a longsword player, and especially if you're a bow or musket player, you should be aiming for the very top of the longsword's head or down at their feet. This will still do damage to them. Mercy of Heaven is the core skill for the longsword. Absolutely everybody who plays longsword should be using this skill, and there is no excuse for not using it. It is absolutely mandatory for every build. The effect of it is it immediately restores 10% of your maximum health, and then it will give you another 2% of your health every second for 10 seconds. Now, if you count that correctly, your health is restored 10% immediately, and 10% for 10 seconds is another 20%. That is 1/3 nearly of your health, 30%. Now, as you can imagine, with a toughness build, if you have 31,000 or 30,000 hit points, for example, you'll be getting 10,000 hit points back every 20 seconds when you use this skill. Now that is incredible. Now that is exactly what makes using toughness in your build worthwhile. So do consider that. I don't consider the full armor build to be the best for this very reason. The other thing it does is it restores the health of nearby allies, and it will restore 1%, not 2, but 1% of their health every second for 10 seconds. So it will give every hero and unit around you an extra 10% hit points. Now, that might not sound like a lot, okay? A 10,000 hit point unit will get all of 1,000 hit points back. But if you're standing in the middle of 30 units, those 30 units will get 1,000 hit points back, and that is 30,000 hit points that you have restored to your team in a very short space of time, and you can do it every 20 seconds. You must have the skill. Now, Nightfall Balance is a little bit of a contentious skill with the longsword. A lot of people who aren't wholly familiar with the longsword will highly recommend you take this, and I think it actually might be a bit more useful in territory wars than it is in random battles, because I find that when I use it in random battles, I give it the speed boost to my team, and they're not sure that it's coming. They didn't know that it was coming, and they weren't prepared to use it. So unless you're going to use it for your own javelins to return them to the supply point a lot quicker, or you're going to use them for things like your pikes to bring them out in front of cavalry very quickly, it's actually not a super useful skill in random battles, but it still is very useful because it will give your own heroes on your side and yourself a speed boost. And as you can imagine, if you've got a whole bunch of heroes on your point, or their point even, and you do that, your team are going to have a very nice buff for the next 9 seconds. It lasts for a long time. It's meant for moving units, but it can be absolutely deadly when used for your heroes on a point or any other time when your team can overwhelm the enemy. Martial Prowess is a fairly interesting skill, and it works really well, especially if you're a full armor build and you need to get some extra hit points back all the time. The best thing about it is while you're doing this skill, it keeps your shield up, so you are still blocking from the front. It's really useful. It's a quick 2 strikes. It doesn't do heaps of damage, but every time you use it, which is about 10 seconds, it will give you 3% of your health back. And that's important if you're not self-healing in other ways with a large toughness pool. The next skill in our skill set is called Paladin. Paladin allows you to do two reasonably slow strikes, a backhand and a forehand, followed by applying a status to the enemy that reduces their defense by 15% for 6 seconds. If you're going to use this skill, you would want to use it the first in your set, so that every attack that follows it will do more damage because the enemy's target's defense is reduced by 15%. If you're curious, this reduction in the target's defense applies to all sources of damage, whether it be your units, others' units, or other heroes. All of them will benefit from the defense being reduced because it is a status applied to the enemy. Shield Bash is a really nice skill. It bashes enemy twice with a shield, and it does cause a whole bunch of blunt damage, which is really good, especially if you've got blunt damage bonus on your sword and shield weapon. One of the things that it does is it actually reduces the block of the target, so that when you hit them again and again, or your units are hitting them, or your friendly heroes are hitting them, it does reduce their block and makes them much more vulnerable. Useful for both heroes and units. The other thing it does is it won't push away heroes, but it will push away soldiers. One of the important skills, the important part of the skill, is that it removes the dazed effect. The dazed effect is the thing that happens when a hero hits you with their standard left attack and your character sort of cringes and sort of pulls back just for a fraction of a second. And if the enemy continually do the left attack, you can't attack them. I'm sure you're familiar with this effect. Now, if you use the Shield Bash effect skill, it will completely undo that, and you'll attack them whether or not they are still attacking you. And of course, because you reduce their block and stun, it will push them back and cause damage to them, and they can't continue attacking you. So very useful skill. With Valor is another core skill of the Longsword. It doesn't matter what build you've got, this one is probably going to be in it. Not definitely, but almost certainly. It does 3 strikes, 1-2, slashing damage straight up, and then it finishes with a kick that will knock down enemies. Now, that kick, you can also move the camera, and instead of attacking all of the attacks in the same direction, it will attack the next attack in the direction that your camera is facing. So the first slash you can do to the left, second slash you can do to the right, you can turn all the way around and do the third slash to the rear, and then you can turn all the way 180 degrees again and do the kick back to the front that you were originally facing. This is a very good skill that does high damage and will knock down heroes and units. The first of the 2 ultimates we're going to talk about is the Sally 4th ultimate. Now this does an absolute buttload of damage, which is really, really wonderful, but it doesn't really have the same utility and amazingness that the other ult has, which we'll talk about in a minute. One thing this does have going for it is it does remove your daze effect, just like the Shield Bash. So if you're getting slapped around by an enemy hero with their auto attacks or anything like that, it will break that daze effect and launch you into the attack. One of the biggest problems with this ult is it's very easy to interrupt. So you'll find that quite often you'll be knocked out of the attack stance before you do your final of the 3 hits, which does the most damage. It can do 6, 7 or even 8,000 damage depending on what you're hitting and depending on what your stats are. However, I simply cannot recommend this ult for this particular hero simply because the other ultimate is so much better. Let's have a look at it. Clash of Shields is one of the best ultimates in the entire game. I would argue for this being one of the best, if not the best, in the entire game. The utility of this ultimate is absolutely insane. It can knock over entire units, entire shield walls. It can knock down advancing Imperial pikes. Charging cavalry, it can stop charging cavalry, all kinds of cavalry, whether it be Lao's Rangers, whether it be Armiger Lancers, whether it be Monastic Knights, Keshegs, it'll stop them all dead in their charge. The only one you have to be a little bit careful of that is the Hussars. Hussars have a very long lance, and before you stun them, they can do damage to you. But if you come in slightly from the side rather than dead straight on, you'll stun them as well. One of the neat things about it is that if you're getting overwhelmed, you can turn around, flip 180 degrees, and use it as an escape, because of course you knock everything out of your way, and you are a little bit faster than running. You can also use it to knock a hero off a horse. When you use this skill, and then you hit them with the Paladin skill earlier to give them minus 50% movement, you will hit them off their horse, knock them down, and then you will give them minus 50% movement. And of course this makes them an easy victim for your team, or even for you, because they'll be on the ground for a long time with that slowed by 75% for 3 seconds. This is absolutely an amazing ultimate. Knocks down shield walls, heroes, absolutely everything. It is just fantastic. You can also use it to save your units. If you have an archer or a gunner unit, for example, who are being charged by Conquerors or Palace Guard, anything like that, a shock troop, even the Landsnakes, the Land Sharks, you can interrupt those charges and give your unit time to get away. It can also be used to knock other heroes off of your friendly heroes. This is where the support comes in for Longsword. If you've got one of your friendly heroes getting trapped by a Jewel Blaze, another one getting trapped by Poleaxe, and the last guy's been kidnapped by a Maul, you can hit this, knock all of those 3 heroes off your friends, and then your friends will get up and beat them silly, because the enemy are slowed by 75% for 3 seconds, and your team will get up first. This is an absolutely fantastic ult, and there is no question of the two, between this one and Sally Forth, this is by far the best ult. So the second to last thing I want to talk to you about is what sort of units complement a longsword and what sort of units don't really get that much benefit from a longsword. So particular units that get really good bonus from a longsword because of the heal and because of their really good ability to move them quickly or support them really well are especially heavy infantry. So Iron Reapers and Sealer Dars do really well because they have a deep hit point pool. Every time you give them a 10% heal, they will gain a lot more hit points than other units. This of course won't heal them any quicker, but it will give them a much bigger block of health back. Also, all the pike units, absolutely all the pike units work really well with the longsword. Again, mostly due to the heal, but also because pike units are generally quite slow, and you can use the Knightly Vow skill to move them into position quickly if you wanted to. For example, the Imperial Pikes, and especially the Fortebrachios, who can't just launch into their skill straight away in the same way that Pike Militia and Imperial Pikes can. They have to set up first. So the speed buff on them is very useful. Muskets. Things like the Tercios, the Imperial Arquebusiers, the Kriegsrats, any sort of musket really benefits really well from the speed boosts and the heal of the longsword. This is because they need to pull in and out of combat, they need to sort of stay a little bit back from the enemy and try and avoid them, but also because they're quite tanky compared to archers, and you get a chance to heal them up, which is what the longsword is really good at. Of course, one of the biggest things that is of benefit is anything with a large shield, whether that be Pavese crossbows, Imperial spearmen, or any kind of shield at all. They will get a great benefit from the healing provided by the longsword, especially when they're in formations where they're constantly taking ranged fire, because they will virtually never die, especially units like the Imperials or the Black Dragons, because they have their own heal as well. So not only is the longsword repeatedly healing every 20 seconds, every sort of 50 seconds to a minute, the unit will also get their own heal, which is really good. I will have a special mention to things like Sapophonorii, which are the flamethrower guys, and things like javelins particularly as well. Because there is a speed buff available to the longsword, they can make these units get back and rearm at the supply point, more ammunition very quickly, and also because you can jump out and do sneaky little ambushes. With javelins you can torpedo a hero who wasn't paying any attention, and with the Sapophonorii you can just jump out in front of large units, large bunches of units, and just absolutely flame the doom out of them. So they're kind of okay, they're kind of complementary. They will not gain a lot of benefit from the heal. Now, units that won't gain a lot of use from the longsword, particularly sword and shield units, so squires, conditori, that sort of thing, prefecture guard, palace guard, because they tend to charge in, they do a lot of damage on the charge, but then they don't last long on the counter attack. And that's a big problem with all of the sword and shield units. They're not very in the main meta of the game at the moment, no matter what they are. Even the Zeregs and the Azaps, as dangerous as they are not really part of the meta, because they go in and do their charge, and then they're dead. You know, a lot of the time. So you don't get a chance to heal them. But of course, the speed boost can be useful with them, even then. And the last one that you don't get a lot of benefit out with longsword is cavalry. Not in the same way like a longbow can still shoot, whether on the back of a horse. A glaive is still excellent for doing damage from the back of the horse. A longbow cannot fight from horseback. Now that is a point I want to make with you. A longsword cannot fight from horseback. They have a very short reach and do a very small amount of damage. don't even bother trying to attack from horseback. So even though you can use cavalry just like any other player, you haven't got your hero skills that will support the cavalry like other heroes will have. It still means you can use cavalry, you just can't support them in the same way that other heroes do. Let's move along and talk about some duels. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is just a couple of duels. And just show our opponent a little bit of respect in duels. Now, duels are particularly relevant to longsword, not only because they are fun, and sometimes on a very rare occasion, you will meet people in the battle that are one-on-one without units. But the most important thing about dueling for a longsword is that often you'll find yourself protecting a point against other heroes, and it might be more than one hero, so you need to know how to do this. So the ones that I like to run in duels are the with Valor, and I like to use the Shield Bash for the stun recovery. Now you notice here that the only time I give him any space is when I need to heal. As much as possible, I want to be right up in the face of this player and try to dodge around them. See how I'm trying to continually try to circle him? And what that does is it makes it very hard for them to hit me with their skills. Especially when you've got a an anti-daze ability, because you can come back from the lighter hits. And do you see how just by staying in really close, you can really damage them? Now this is quite different to how it worked in previous times where you would use the Paladin skill to slow them. That doesn't happen anymore. The Paladin doesn't have a slow. So the way that we have to do this is then to get in close and circle around them and keep your block up all the time. Watch how we do this. Nadachis are pretty nasty in duels, all right? I think most of you veteran players will know that. So how do we avoid this player getting to use his massive CC abilities on us? And watch how I just try and get in close as much as possible and just circle around him. Make it very difficult for them to hit you with the skills. You know, with a wide sweeping weapon like a Nadachi, it's really easy to hit you with basic attacks, but you've got your shield. Right? And when he backs himself into a corner like this, well, that works in your favor because you can just circle around them. See this? I'm not really losing any health, and he's not really got the ability to continue to heal himself back with his skills. I'm right up in his face as much as possible, making it very difficult to target me. And when they do land hits, it is, of course, much harder. To keep you down, much harder to keep you down because you've got the daze ability where you can pop straight back up as soon as the knockdown part of the CC happens. And see this? They don't really stand all that much of a chance. Give yourself room only when you need to heal. Otherwise, get right up close and circle around them, holding your right click and clicking your left mouse button. Try this technique. It's really useful. So boys and girls, that concludes my guide today on the longsword, the king and mightiest of all weapons in Conqueror's Blade. I really hope you enjoyed it. Just as some parting shots, I want to remind you that this guide is definitely geared towards the newer players, and of course something that you've probably noticed that's different from this guide to a lot of other guides you've seen online is that I play the death out of longsword. I know just so much about this. I don't know everything, nobody can claim that, but I really spend many hours, hundreds of hours playing the longsword. So really do take what I say as a little bit of a guide to what you can do as well. And if you want to join me on the Discord server, have a check downstairs here in the, not the comments section, but the video information, and I will totally talk to you and give you some more advice. And of course, we've got lots of other people in this Discord server that will be happy to help you as well. Anyway, I hope you learned something new, or you just enjoyed the video. Thanks for coming to my channel. Hey guys, Knight here. Thanks for watching my videos. I make these in my spare time for a bit of fun, so hopefully you learned something or you just enjoyed watching. It would really help me out if you would subscribe and like my videos. See you on the battlefield.